All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Jeff McDonald, and I'd like to welcome you to this distinguished lecture series. This is supported, of course, by the Global Institute for Water Security and also Global Water Futures project that's providing funds to underwrite the series and connect to our partners around the country and around the world. Just a reminder that next week will be our last presentation, and this will be given by Genevieve Alley, coming to us from Guelph University in Ontario. And before we get started, we want to just acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to this First Nation and Métis ancestry of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And it's a pleasure today to introduce a friend and colleague, Stefan Krause, coming to us from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Stefan is professor and chair of eco-hydrology and biogeochemistry, and he's also director of the Birmingham Water Council, along with many other roles that he has at Birmingham University. He finished his PhD in 2005 at University of Potsdam in Germany and has been at Birmingham since, I believe, 2012. He also holds other concurrent and honorary positions. He's an invited research professor at the University of Claude Bernard in France, and a visiting senior research fellow at the Leibniz Institute for Freshwater Ecology in Berlin. Stefan is really exploding on the scene and has been for a number of years. His two most recent papers, one in Nature Sustainability and the other in Nature, are really exciting insights into current water quality issues as it relates to COVID, as it relates to social media uptake, as it relates to the topic of today's talk, which is on microplastics. This is in addition to 20 other papers I think he published in 2020. And Stefan has become really an international thought leader in this general field of water quality. He's been very active in terms of organizing meetings. One I attended in 2017, Hydro Eco, probably is still one of the best meetings I've ever attended. He's an associate editor for many of our top journals, Eco-Hydrology, Wires Water, Frontiers in Hydrogeosphere, and is also vice president of the International Association of Water Quality. And it's just a delight to welcome Stefan to us. We're hoping to engage in collaborations in the coming months and years, and having you physically to Saskatoon in the future, Stefan. But in the meantime, we're just looking forward to your talk today. So thanks for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure, at least virtually, being with you and having the ability to present our research in this series. And as Jeff said, I'm going to talk today about river corridors as global hotspots for microplastic accumulation, degradation, and their environmental impacts, and would like to highlight that this is the work of a whole range of grad students and postdocs. And I want to really highlight two of my postdocs, Drs. Hollinell and Jen Drummond, whose results I'm going to present here, as well as one of the PhD students I co-supervise in Lyon, Mohamed Wasner, and one of my good friends and colleagues, Professor Jesus Gomez from Vanderbilt University, who we did quite a lot of the modeling with that I'm going to talk about today. As Jeff mentioned, in our group, there's a strong focus on the different water challenges in this world. A lot of the water research is hosted under the auspices of the Birmingham Water Council and the Institute of Global Innovation that really trying to look into water resources and the management of water resources under globally changing environmental conditions, in particular focusing on the interactions between different stressors, different pollution stressors, on the interfaces between often freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. Many of them we coin as eco-hydrological interfaces, and where we are looking into the environmental fate and the impacts of interacting pollutants that can be legacy pollutants or more emerging pollutants. And I pulled up only two papers that I've had the luck to co-author recently, where I really try to highlight that we see humans at the center of interacting with the water cycle in both with regards to water resources and water quantity, as well as water quality, and that of course a lot of that stressors that we have been experiencing over the long term of the last couple of decades with regards to changing of hydroclimatological extremes and in their frequency and their magnitude caused a lot of pressure on the human interaction with the water cycle. And a lot of that we have only seen accelerating since the start of that really critical pandemic we have been in. And Jeff mentioned a paper we have been just publishing there in Nature Sustainability about how the pandemic is putting a particular strain on communities and their dependency on water for sanitation and hygiene to protect themselves. Still, apart from vaccines being the main WHO proclaimed source of protection against the virus, is a regular hand washing with water and soap, and which sounds very trivial to many of us, but is not at all in the world. So there's a wide range of different water quality and water pollution related topics we are working on. The one I want to talk about mainly today is related to plastic pollution. And there has been a real increasing interest probably over the last 5-6 years in plastic pollution. That has been a topic in the marine science community for longer, for probably the last 1 or 2 decades. At least there was with a couple of TV programs like Planet Earth a few years ago, and the Blue Planet, a real uprise and outcry about plastic pollution, a very emotional topic that really seems to raise the interest of everyone, and almost everyone seems to have an opinion about plastic and plastic pollution. My 6-year-old daughter has one, my 95-year-old granny has one, and people can get very emotional about plastic pollution, in particular because it affects our all-day lives and everyday life in so many aspects. In particular, since we are so dependent on it, and we only start to understand how it affects us, how it affects the environment, and how it affects us. There has been, as I learned from my polymer chemist colleagues in Birmingham, who I nicked this slide from, there's been a long tradition of research on plastics in Birmingham, actually, and they're very proud to having been one of the first places of the development of plastics and synthetic polymers, with Parkinson, which was named under Alexander Parks, developed out of dissolving nitrocellulose, which is a flammable nitric ester on cotton or wood cellulose, and using solvents such as alcohol or wood naphtha. He developed some synthetic polymers, as they are shown on the right here, and as I mentioned, the ingredients, you can imagine they're highly flammable themselves. So you could spark them. That wouldn't be the material you want to get on a plane these days. Not that we are able to fly anywhere at the moment anyway. So, but there was a lot of research on creating plastics in Birmingham, and of course in the early 1920s, a real boost in polymer chemistry to create plastic, and a lot of that was driven by actually wanting to protect the environment, wanting to protect resources that got overused. So there was a good intention initially. But of course, there's been a severe shift. And what I put up here is just the front covers of the Life magazine from '55 and National Geographic from 2018, from an almost euphoric welcoming of plastics as a material that improved our lives in so many aspects and made our lives so much easier, so much safer, so much cheaper. So we really rely a lot on that too. Nowadays, us recognizing there are a lot of problems with plastic, and plastic gets a lot of bad press for right reasons, and sometimes maybe not. So we have to find a way living with plastics, and I try to shed some light on how we can potentially do that. What are the reasons that we are so concerned about plastics, the main reasons are threefold: that we have increasingly developed an understanding of their environmental impacts, of their ecotoxicological impacts. Sometimes they are macroscopically visible, and a lot of in the TV programs that I mentioned, that has been highlighted quite a lot. There are a lot of more microscopic impacts on public health that we only start to understand, in particular with regards to prevalence of non-communicable diseases with relation not only to plastics and microplastic, nanoplastic particles themselves, but to a lot of the additives that are contained in plastics, like endocrine disrupting substances like bisphenol A or nonylphenol phthalates and flame retardants that can have either endocrine or affecting or cancerogenous risks and pose that risks to us. And there's an increasing awareness of the impacts on ecosystem services with regards to affecting the soil microbiome, potentially affecting the bottom of the food chain, and with that basically food production across the world. And of course, the health of ecosystems we increasingly rely on. We have seen a real dependence on of societies on plastic, and you can see that this is only since the 1950s. The amount of plastic that has been produced globally, that stops in 2015, that data. You can see the heavy reliance that we have on plastics and our economy, and really nicely in 2008, that's the last world economic crisis, and you see how it dips. So we see with an economic crisis also the production of plastic dipping. We probably will not see the same with the crisis we have at the moment, just because of the sheer amount of single-use plastics for medical purposes right now. But what I generally try to highlight here is that our economy, our lifestyle is very much dependent on plastic, and with that use of plastic comes the problem, which is not necessarily only plastic as a product, but plastic as a waste. And as we have increased the amount of plastic production, absolutely mirror to that, we have also increased the production of plastic waste. And the one thing I really want to highlight here is not just this really strong increase over the last 70 years, but is the fraction of main plastic waste sources. And you see that packaging makes more or less half of all the plastic waste that we are producing globally, with then consumer products, a lot of that being either textiles or other short duration products, making the majority of plastic waste. And that becomes really important when we think about what we can do with, or how we can deal with that problem of basically mismanaged plastic waste in the environment. If we try to quantify how big the problem of plastics and plastic waste is, these are data here that have been published by colleagues in 2017, data from 2010, where we at that time had roughly 10,000 megatons of plastic being produced. A lot of that, roughly a quarter, was still in use. A tiny fraction is recycled. Of course, that recycling is not continuously going on. Many plastics you can recycle or are recycled once or twice. Some of that is incinerated, and that's often proclaimed as a solution to the plastic problem. But of course, the majority of plastics still are produced by conventional hydrocarbons, so that has a climate footprint as well. And a lot of plastic is, oops, wrong direction, is discarded either into landfills. Quite often it doesn't stay there. In particular, in many countries with not very elaborate waste management systems, plastics is eroding, or material generally is eroding, and with that plastic from landfill sites. There's a real plastic waste trade, and China only very recently, 2 years ago, closed its borders to plastic waste, which since then is still shipped out of many European countries, North America, but is landing further south in Southeast Asia, or is dispersed in the environment, including in our river ecosystems, in agriculture, in our soils. And the quality of waste management across the world is varying very drastically, and that has a significant impact on the risks plastic can pose to the environment. Just before I finish with that brief introduction of why we care about plastic and plastic waste, a little bit of an outlook. And these were two papers that have just come out in Science in September by two different teams running different types of scenarios. And some of them are very ambitious scenarios of how plastic waste production, not just plastic production, but plastic waste production could be reduced in the next couple of decades. And the worrying scenario there is that even with very drastic policies to reduce, well, on the one hand side, you can see there's a wide portfolio of potential development into the future. But even with very drastic and economically very ambitious strategies to reduce plastic use, to increase the reuse of plastic-based materials, to improve the retainment of plastic waste or the treatment of plastic waste, to increase recycling, we are dealing with a plastic problem for decades and centuries to come. Even in the best scenario, we see still for quite a while an increase in plastic waste production. And the most realistic scenarios anyway. And I have to say, none of these scenarios, there are papers that came out in September, but that were written a little bit earlier. None of these have had the ability to react to the COVID pandemic and the significant increase in demand in single-use plastic for personal protective equipment and medical applications. So what are the main strategies dealing with plastic? On the one hand side, that is a shift towards a circular economy, an economy where maybe starting with consuming less, that's always a good approach, but also consuming in a way that material can be recycled and can be resourced from recycled material and waste can be retained. We reduce the amount of waste that is created and ends up in the environment. And the other is cleaning up plastics from the environment. I must say I'm very concerned about pushes towards a large-scale cleanup operations. You will have heard about some happening in the oceans and in particular to clean up the ocean gyres, principally because of I think we need to tackle the problem closer to the source, not at the sink. It's a sheer Sisyphean kind of effort and also energy demand to collect plastic far from where we have actually created that waste. But I think there's definitely scope, like some of the colleagues we are working with here, the 7 Clean Seas operation, who we work with, for instance, in Vietnam to develop their first pilot to clean up plastic from river ecosystems much closer to the source, so long before plastic actually enters the ocean. But you can already imagine where the sheer challenges are, and with that, the work starts for hydrologists like us, which is we need to understand what the sources are, how the sources, the terrestrial sources, get activated, how basically plastic waste that gets mismanaged ends up in waterways, gets transported in waterways, breaks down, impacts on waterways, and gets out to the oceans. And that really requires a systems approach that is integrating the different risks, the ecotoxicological and toxicological risks, and quantify their impacts. And in order to really best advise on the targeting of cleanup approaches, as well as approaches on a regulatory or behavioral basis in a circular economy. So we try to attempt helping and improving the understanding there from adopting a catchment perspective to plastic waste and seeing plastic as a pollutant, a particulate pollutant, like many other pollutants we have been working on as well, like engineered nanoparticles or particulate organic matter. And that made us really opening kind of the curtain and looking into the plastic problem in a different way. A lot of plastic research has been done in the oceans, and a lot of plastic research still is dominated by knowledge that is very valid in the oceans, but only to in the marine systems and coastal systems, but only to a small degree transferable to actually terrestrial and aquatic environments, and where if I achieve something today, then that's busting a couple of myths, and that's that the oceans are a main sink for plastics. They are a sink for plastic, but by far not the main. And I'm going to show you some data there that are evidencing that we deal with plastic, much larger quantities of plastic and much longer storage of plastic in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. I would like to present you with some evidence that rivers are not purely conduits for plastic that ends up in the oceans, but that a lot is happening to plastics in rivers, that we can use our understanding of how river networks and catchment functions to understand how plastic sources get activated, how plastics get transported in rivers, how they get stored there, and how they impact aquatic ecosystems, really based on the variability of residence times of that pollutants that we are seeing in rivers, and that are really not as short as people often assume. That in fact they can be decades to centuries, if not longer. And that's not even thinking about groundwater, where I come to right in the end today. So we know from ocean sciences that in the oceans, through a multitude of different trawling exercises, people have found between 30,000 and roughly 250,000 metric tons of plastic. That's mainly macroplastics. That doesn't really include microplastic, or not to a larger degree at least. These are estimated to be between 5 and 50 trillion plastic particles. And there's an increasing amount of research still done in the marine community to refine that numbers. But I appreciate I'm going to talk about a couple of really large numbers, and it's difficult to keep them in mind. So I try to refer back to them as I talk about the global budgets. But keep in mind maybe between 30 and 1,000 and 250,000 metric tons of plastics have been found in the oceans. That's what we get so concerned about when we see plastic in the ocean gyres. That's what's causing the attention of the media there. There's been some really groundbreaking work from people out of Toronto, out of the University of Georgia, out of a couple of European universities and Australia as well in the last 5, 6, 7 years, that try to quantify how much of that plastic actually comes from the continents and is transported by the rivers. They have restricted their view predominantly to contributions from coastal areas, restricted to 50-kilometer margins from the coast. So I really highlight that the numbers I'm mentioning now are really focusing only on 50 kilometers away from the coast. And in 2010, we know from data from the World Bank that primary plastic production in that year was roughly 270 million metric tons. A bit more than that, and that's because you have an overhang from previous years, was actually created as plastic waste, of which they quantified roughly a third to a quarter to a third was created as plastic waste in that coastal zone. And a third of that was mismanaged. That meant it was not contained in any landfill site, it was not incinerated or etc. So that's 30 million metric tons. Yeah, keep in mind the number I mentioned before. What has been found in the oceans? It's 1 to 2 orders magnitudes, at least less than that. Yeah. So they estimated that around 8 million, between 4.8 and 12.7 million metric tons have entered the oceans in 2010 alone. So significantly more than plastics that have been found in the oceans. I need to highlight also with their focus on 50 kilometers ocean margins only, they exclude a lot of Central Asian countries. I'm always joking, Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovenia, they don't contribute anything. The River Danube, the River Rhine, some major rivers, fast European standards of major rivers, they would not get any sourcing of plastic waste according to this estimate. So I think we can surely assume these are conservative estimates for that reason, but still they are orders of magnitude more than what people found in the oceans. So what is the reason for that? There's a lot of speculation. And people rightly so bring on a lot of arguments that there might be accumulation still in sewage treatment works, in sediments, and I'm going to show you that indeed is the case. We find a lot in river sediments. There might be non-buoyant plastic polymers that sink down to the ocean floor, and there indeed is people find a lot of plastic on deep ocean sediments. And there might be fragmentation of plastic particles into sized fractions that get harder and harder for us to find. And that indeed is definitely also the case. In particular, as still the detection of plastic particles in the nanoscale from environmental media is still very challenging, and eventually all microplastic break down into this really small micro and then nanoplastic fractions. A main challenge is that the majority of models, like our model that I'm going to show you just in a minute, and the model that they've been using is basically simulating plastic transport based on particles. So they're all based on particle tracking. And one thing we really struggle is to relate due to the sheer wide range of different properties of synthetic polymers, of plastics in use, and the sizes of plastic particles relating from the breakdown of microplastic to relate particles to an actual mass when we do that estimate. So that's a real probably one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in modeling this at a global as well as at significantly smaller scale plastic transport and fate in the environment. So what I'm going to show you, where we try to elucidate some of these questions in the next couple of minutes, is how we use models as well as observational networks to identify sources of plastics and their spatial distributions, and how they get activated based on different behaviors, consumer behaviors, hydrometeorological conditions, and what their fate in the environment is, where they accumulate, either temporarily or permanently, how they break down, and what impact they're causing there. So I basically want to show how we quantify where plastic are, where they accumulate, how much, and really importantly, for how long. How do we do that? I'm going to show you some global modeling results initially. Some work that I do together with Jesus Gomez Valles, who is the brain behind the model here, really a fantastic global modeler. We're using a particle tracking model. He's presenting much more on that at AGU this year. Has just uploaded last minute, as usual, his presentation. We use the fantastic data set of the HydroRivers, updated HydroRivers data set that's freely available, a fantastic source of hydrochats, and we quantify the input of mismanaged plastic waste that has potential to enter river networks. We quantify how much of that gets stored over what time in river networks, and we quantify how much of the mismanaged plastic waste is put out to the ocean. And what we use for that is relatively conventional sediment transport theory, as it is used for other sediments as well. I'm looking forward to discuss some of the assumptions we are making in models like these with the students in an hour's time. This is the picture we are facing in result. If you look at the global picture here, you see there's more granularity than in previous models. So we definitely see some Asian, in particular Southeast Asian countries, are definitely areas where a lot of plastic waste accumulates. So what the map is showing you, the accumulation of plastic waste. We simulated it here for 2010 because that's a comparison with what has been simulated for that 50-kilometer margins. And we simulate that roughly 120 million metric tons in 2010 have been accumulated in river networks, in river catchments in that year. So if we extend our view beyond that 50-kilometer margins, and I want to focus your attention really on that area that I hope you can see that I'm just circling around with the cursor right now, which is basically the Gangetic Plains and the River Ganges, because I present you some observational data from that in a couple of minutes. Of course, as you can see, the majority of that is significantly further away than 50 kilometers from the oceans, and it's one of the most heavy polluted streams globally with plastic. We also find that a lot of plastic is accumulated not just in exorheic river basins, but also in endorheic river basins, which really is, when we think about long-term sinks of plastic waste, becomes more and more important, because that plastic, at least through fluvial transport pathways, never sees the oceans. Of course, there's always aeolian transport as well, and I'm lucky enough to work with a couple of researchers, Stefan and Allen, who are just starting to look into how important aeolian transport, in particular, of the very smaller fractions of plastic are. Most importantly, we see a lot of plastic being accumulated in areas that are significantly further away from the coast than 50 kilometers. If you look into the panels C and D here, they are on the x-axis, they have a logarithmic scale, a logarithmic length scale as given as distance from the ocean. And you see there for the different continents for exorheic and endorheic rivers. So exorheic, that rivers that end in the oceans, and endorheic that end in an inland endpoint. As well as then for some of the major plastic transporting rivers in the world, you see where the majority of plastic in this river basins is accumulated and is entering streams. And if you only look at the 50% range there, for focusing in particular on Asia, which really is the hotspot of plastic waste production, we are roughly in the 500 kilometers, so one order of magnitude further distance from the oceans, where there's a majority of, or at least more than 50% of plastic enter in river networks. Why do I think that is important? I think that really highlights the importance that river networks play for the transport as well as potential long-term accumulation, and with that impact and risk of plastic pollution. So I really think we need to shift our focus from being only concerned in the oceans. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I just say we should have a broader view on where plastics may have an impact on ecosystems. And there's a lot of space, and with that, a lot of time where plastic can affect ecosystems further away from the oceans actually as well. Another finding of our global effort, modeling effort, there was that while the initial models of global plastic productions have identified, in particular, large rivers being main contributors of plastic and plastic waste to the oceans, we have, I think, successfully shown here that the majority of large rivers actually are, because they are so affected by regulations of their flow, in particular the building of reservoirs and dams where flow velocity goes down to zero and a lot of sediment is accumulating, that in particular the fraction, which is basically the blue fraction here of that large rivers that sees the oceans, is actually smaller than for many of the intermediate sized rivers. That if we are concerned about plastic transport to the oceans, we should probably pay more attention to than we are doing right now. But we should definitely, for the large rivers, be very concerned about all the plastics that get stored there for a much longer time. If you look into that rivers that have been identified previously as the main contributors of plastics to the oceans, only two of them, the Congo and the Amazon, have a significant fraction of free-flowing contributions that contribute significant amount of plastics. Many others have, the majority of them are actually dammed, which means they still deliver a lot of plastics to the oceans, but even more plastics is likely to be trapped behind that dams. And I show you two examples that I just picked out here. One, mainly because that's where I'm going to show you experimental data for in a second as well, which are the Ganges Basin, and this is the whole Ganges Basin, and the Mekong River Basin, Southeast Asia, where we quantified how much plastics has been stored there in our model, running it from 1950 up to 2020. How much has been put in there, how much is stored, and how much is put out. And the really, to a degree, scary results were that only 2.5% of the plastics that has entered that catchments in the last 70 years has actually reached the sea. It's a majority for both rivers. More than 97% of plastics that have entered is still contained in the catchment, is sitting still in the river basins, in the river sediments, in the river corridors. Of course, these global models at the moment, you can probably model everything. It's really hard to validate these models. But if we compare our model results with other model results, we are very much in the same range of what other people have modeled. These are modeling results for the Ganges as well as for the Mekong that have been published by colleagues in 2017. These are their annual deliveries of plastics to the oceans. Ours were those that were accumulated over 70 years, and we end up with almost exactly the same results, which highlights that amount that is still in storage and cycling through that river basins is critically high. That also leaves the question, what's happening to that in the future? And what legacy actually of pollution have we created here? We always talk about plastic as an emerging pollutant, but we have been polluting the environment with that for 70 years. So we are quite efficient actually polluting the environment for that time. We here run some scenarios that are more conservative than of that two science papers that I referred to by colleagues early on. We are just assuming what is going to be the delivery of plastics from that rivers if we continue with plastic emissions from 2020. But we also wanted to know what would happen if we stop magically emitting plastic waste into the environment right now. And the really intriguing result for both rivers was that while we would see a significant decrease by roughly 50% in the first year, we would get this really long-term kind of bleeding out of plastic waste together with the other sediments over decades and actually centuries to come. So we clearly have created a significant legacy. That's not taken into account any degradation of that. So it's a conservative transport model here. And that highlights one of the big development areas in modeling plastic transport, that we are still adding understanding, very basic understanding of what the main drivers of plastic transport are and the interaction of plastic particles with streambed sediments. Previously, there was mainly a translation of knowledge from marine sciences into freshwater sciences, taking into account gravity settling of plastic, because that's one of the main processes in the oceans. But there have been papers being published earlier this year by colleagues from University of Bayreuth, Sven Fry, and others that have highlighted the importance of hypereic exchange and hypereic exchange, so that exchange of surface water with a stream bed. It's one of my pet topics. Actually, that's what brought me into the whole plastic area. It has really shown to be in rivers a main contributor of plastic trapping in sediments. And Jen Drummond is a research fellow working with me, whose work I'm very briefly introducing. He has shown quite a lot of that, and she has been working with microplastics as in particle transport for quite a while, and the modeling of that. She has developed a model that's a bit similar to the Otis model as a transient storage model. It's called a mobile immobile model. It's a stochastic modeling approach that you can use to simulate the exchange between particles in the surface, how it is exchanged with the porous matrix of a stream bed, and how particles in the dependency of turbulent flow can enter that porous matrix, but also can exit after that hypereic exchange flow path again. And what she has shown, I really want to highlight the top figure here only, or the top part of that figure. I'm looking forward to discuss that paper a bit more with the students a little bit later. Is the ratio between particle transport through hypereic exchange versus particle transport through gravity settling into streambed environments. And you see that dashed line is basically showing a line where the ratio between hypereic exchange versus gravity settling is equal. And she has been doing that for different diameters of plastic particles and for different densities, basically representing different plastic types, from polyurethane to PVC and PET, etc. And the main outcome of her research really is that, probably not surprisingly, with an increase in flow velocity, you see an increase in that hypereic trapping of particles, both in quantities of particles as well as duration of particle residence time in the hypereic zone. But that is much more pronounced for smaller particles, which means you entrap much more likely smaller particles through hypereic exchange in sediments than larger particles. But you also transport them more likely into deeper parts of sediments, where they are retained for a longer time than just sitting on the surface of sediments. And that explains a lot of our experimental findings, where we find low density plastics that were meant to be floating on the surface, but we find them in streambed sediments, so gravity settling would have not explained why we find them, where we find them. So that's some really intriguing results from her. And I just said what I'm showing here. So with an increase in flow velocity, you see an increase in the ratio of hypereic exchange versus gravity settling, and that in particular for really smaller fractions of particle sizes, in particular that particles less than 100 micrometers and going down almost into the nanoscale. These are the ones that we are mainly concerned about when it comes to environmental and ecotoxicological risks, of course. So, however, rule number one in modeling, and in this case, literally, is you have if you put in rubbish, you just get out rubbish, and a lot of the quality of the modeling depends on how good you can actually observe in the field and constrain your models. And I'm going in the last 10 minutes just show you some results of where I think we can really, through some integrated campaigns, often including citizens as well, improve the knowledge base of plastics in the environment. We have started actually working on plastics on our doorsteps. That's River Tame, as we thought until that point. One of the most polluted rivers in Britain, and we found doing work with an MSc student there a couple of years ago that there was a very poor relationship between population density or density of wastewater treatment plants and the density or concentration of plastics in surface waters, which is the loading function of all of the models that I've just been talking about. But then, in fact, the positioning of some smaller lakes, as you can see here, caused a drop of plastic concentration and then a downstream increase again. And again, it's not that surprising. It's something that we know from sediment transport theory, of course, already, but it's something that we don't consider so far when it comes to parameterization of our plastic transport models. However, another finding was when we compared our results, which is the River Tame. Here we had a bit less than 20 particles per 100 grams of sediments. We compared that to an earlier study, one of the first by colleague Alice Horton, done on the Thames, roughly similar amount, and then some colleagues at the University of Manchester had a paper roughly the same time as us from a river just south of Manchester, which had almost 2 order of magnitude higher concentrations. We were like, wow. So maybe we are not hosting the most polluted river in Britain, in Birmingham. Maybe that's a wrong assumption, but it made us revise what sampling procedures, extraction procedures, and analytical procedures people are using globally, and made us aware, which is probably not uncharacteristic for such an emerging theme, that they were hardly comparable at all. And I by no means want to say that one is better than another. I definitely don't want to say that ours is better than any of the others used by others. I just want to say they were so different that an intercomparison of published data was almost impossible. And that's, of course, a real problem if you want to look in a comparative way in what is published and found by colleagues worldwide. So that triggered our thinking of we have to create standards and help together with our friends in the scientific community to create more comparable data to improve our modeling capacity as well. And we funded the Lebanon Trust luckily funded our project which is called the 100 Plastic Rivers, and Dr. Holly Nell is the main brain and postdoc behind running that, who spent almost a year in designing a really robust technique to sample sediments and surface waters across the world that we sent around to colleagues across the world, where they are sampling for us, send us back, they filtrate their sediments, and we are analyzing it to create basically the first freshwater and catchment-wide database of an open access database of plastics outside of the oceans. She had a lot of method development to do for that, in particular to increase what looks most MacGyverish in this picture. It's not the high-tech, high-spec analytical part of the whole analysis chain, but the extraction units. And that's where she spent a lot of time on creating, improving basically the throughput, because if you want to run with if you want to run large sample numbers in your lab, you need to be able to realize and reduce this really time-limiting step. And she was very successful with it. And created also, using fluorescent stains of polymers, created some protocols that are now more and more widely used to really benchmark the detection accuracy, and very importantly, because a lot of the identification of plastics is done by eye by a master student, PhD student, postdoc, researcher, sitting in a dark room for a much too long time and getting tired and dizzy, counting fluorescent particles. So she really managed to quantify observer bias in this process as well, which is really important, and the dependence of that from different types of polymers. So I think a lot of that groundwork was really very essential to allow us now to roll this out. We tested it together with a charity. That guys had the most amazing job sailing around with interested citizens, the English Channel. So they sailed around both the British as well as the French coast, collected samples mainly from estuaries out to the Scilly Isles and then back in Brittany and France. And we just published a paper with them 2 weeks ago about that exercise, evidencing, well, basically better testing our new protocols for plastic sampling and extraction, and at the same time identifying plastic the types of plastics as they accumulate in the estuaries of large rivers along the British Channel. I really finding very interesting dependencies on the tidal regime, and finding that some very distant places like the Scilly Isles, like they're famous in Britain for their natural beauty, and for rightly so. They are in a marine protected area, but you see there's some real hotspots for microplastic pollution, highlighting that quite often it's really more distal sources that are causing a lot of pollution in these areas. Of course, there an interaction between plastics coming from the oceans, polluting the coast layers, as well as a local pollution as well. And now we are rolling this out globally. This is the starting map. We are intrigued. The first sample that we got back actually was from Punta Arenas, so from Tierra del Fuego, and we get samples coming back, overwhelming us a little bit, frankly, from all over the world. But I guess that's a luxury problem to deal with. And we are in the process of analyzing them and rolling out our program to not just create shots and snapshot samples from of plastic pollution, but really trying also to use that protocol to sample some of the largest and some of the most polluted rivers worldwide, using protocols that we have developed together with colleagues in Europe, together with colleagues from the USGS, tried last year this time at Boulder Creek in Colorado, and then went out right after that to sample 3,000 kilometers of the Ganges River in November and early December last year. And where I think I'm going to finish with these results. These are basically a week old, and Holly has just presented them this week at Micro 2020, this biannual microplastic conference, where she has been highlighting the value of this data set, basically showing how plastic accumulation along the Ganges, where you can see in bar charts plastics in sediments, and the line is plastics in the surface water itself. It's highlighting some real hotspots, often very interestingly related to places of religious worship or of very significant cultural relevance, like Varanasi, just upstream of Patna, etc., and some very interesting mixing behavior that we are exploring right now, together with a whole range of other traces that we have observed, and co-pollutants. And I'm just finishing maybe with saying, yeah, watch the space. So we are analyzing this magnificent data set. It has taken her and two handful of colleagues almost a year, and working through the pandemic with the microscopes at home to analyze these data. There's a wealth of data coming together there, and they're about to chucking the first papers of that out in the coming months. Thank you.
Well, Stefan, that was really an incredible talk and a wonderful, wonderful overview of the whole microplastic situation. So thanks very much. I'm sure there is clapping happening through the ether celebrating this talk. So thanks again. as we wait for questions to come in, and I think some questions are already rolling in, I just wanted to ask, what can we learn about the processes and how the world works from the microplastic thing? So, in my world, tritium was injected into the atmosphere with thermonuclear bomb testing. It peaked in 1963, and we've been monitoring, how this plays out and learning so much about groundwater age and mixing and things we wouldn't have known without that. I'm wondering, is there something comparable with microplastics that we're learning about the world, with microplastics kind of being your vehicle to that learning?
Absolutely, yeah. There definitely is, Jeff, and I think it's a still very underexplored resource. I mean, basically, plastics themselves, with more than 80,000 different polymers, synthetic polymers being in use, give us a plethora of well, a natural / artificial tracer to work with, and probably the easiest to target that is where you have known spills of plastics of known properties and quantities. To give you one example, there was a significant spill of plastic nurdles, several containers in Durban Harbor. Actually, Holly worked on that before she worked with me. That was spilled and then transported out to the oceans and surprised marine scientists because they saw that very well-defined nurdles as a tracer emerging around the South African coast and at a much faster speed than they expected to, and a lot about well, it's a sediment but with very weird characteristics and properties, right? And a lot of that we can use, in particular where we know what we are starting from, there's of course the opportunity for dating as well, and we just discussed with colleagues the analysis of cores to be taken from reservoirs as well as some lakes. There has been one study coming out of San Diego in Science Advances earlier this year where people have analyzed one core of basically a beach on the Pacific using the warping of sediments in there. Surprised me how warped it was actually to identify, to age basically the age of the Anthropocene, as they coined it there, with the plastic horizons in there. And we can see the different pollution histories, because we know there was swapping of additives to plastics, right? There things like BPA are disappearing from plastics, so we can use that knowledge to then use that additives often, even if it's not the plastics themselves, for using them as a tracer. But it's definitely an underexplored area.
Fascinating. We got several questions coming in. One by Jacqueline about road construction. Just cycling through the question here. Wondering about plastics from road construction.
Yeah.
And if plastics do get reused as road construction, do you believe that leaching into groundwater is a concern, or can that be reduced by new method of how the road is built, maybe with a lay down a bottom of pure concrete and then adding the microplastic? And
I think what that question is probably alluding to is that there are some projects running, I know some in India at least, that are trying to recycle plastic that is built into concrete in order to actually store it in concrete and for road work in particular, not just construction, which I think is worrying because of course we disperse it just in a different way. And we know that some of the first detections of microplastics in freshwater ecosystems were actually from road markings, so the paintings on roads. And we know that car tire wear and tear and brake products are some of the main sources for microplastics and rubber as well in freshwater ecosystems, soils and groundwater. And we see the arrival of that in groundwater, which is, given the vulnerability of the food webs there, which is quite concerning. Yeah.
Interesting. That maybe relates to this next question by Marcus Brinkman, who is asking about hypereic exchange and wondering how much do we know about the difference in behavior between fibers. Oh, I lost it there. Sorry, just scrolling down. Between fibers and more evenly shaped particles. We find that the majority of plastics leaving the treatment plant here in Saskatoon and in many other Western countries are fibers rather than beads of denser particles.
Yes, I have two answers to that. So one is we know very little about the behavior of different particle shapes. If I would have talked a bit faster, I had a couple of more slides of some control experiments that we run in our Flume labs at the moment, where we are looking into exactly that, how different types of particles get trapped through hypereic exchange. And we use fibers and fragments. With regard to the wastewater treatment plant, and we know that the main inputs into wastewater treatment plants are fibers from laundry, etc. Of course, we think, though, of course, from some of the work that Holly has done, that there's potentially there's a risk, at least, of an underrepresentation of non-fiber polymers, non-fibrous polymers in freshwater ecosystems, because fibers quite often look so suspicious. They are quite easy to detect, and one of the results that her work evidenced was that when I talked about observer bias and trying to improve that through using this fluorescent stains to create more evidence what really is a synthetic polymer and what might be a very different but natural fiber. We have a lot of natural fibers in the environment as well. There's a risk that a lot of fragments have actually not been identified as synthetic polymers because they were more covered by biofilms. They look more like some organic dirt actually under the microscope until you stain them, whereas the fiber is easier to detect.
Interesting. A question by Peter. Can you say something about the degradation of plastics in the aquatic versus the marine environment?
Yeah, it's complex, which is an unsatisfying answer. I appreciate, but there's a lot of research going on in that field, and together with many industry partners. Actually, we work together with agrochemical industry partners there, particularly, who want to anticipating shifts in regulation in North America, throughout Europe. They really push towards using more biodegradable materials, and biodegradability is rather ill-defined at the moment as degradability in a composter, basically, which is very different to real environmental conditions. So what we are doing is we simulate more environmental realistic scenarios through the flumes in our ecolab or the soil columns there to look into how long do different polymers under different environmental conditions require to degrade. What do they degrade to? And what do they actually leach due to that process as well? So we are quite interested in the interaction with biota through that process. So we call it biofouling and aging of particles, and how that affects their transport properties themselves as well, which is quite dynamic and interesting. But also how it affects their settling in environments where then they degrade differently, in particular with relation to UV exposure, to interaction with organic matter and biofilm.
Interesting. Question by Gian. You talked about the Gomez-Kellez-Krause paper where you mentioned mismanaged plastic wastes. Can you explain a bit more about the mismanagement practices and any insights on what can be done to improve management to reduce plastic pollution?
Yes. So the loading function that or information that we use there for our model, which is similar to what people in other global models have used before. It's a fantastic, freely accessible data set by the World Bank looking into plastic consumption, per capita plastic consumption per country, and then an assessment of the based on the waste management practices in the different countries, an estimate of the per capita production of managed and mismanaged plastic waste. The mismanaged means if you live in many, not all, low and middle income countries, of course, your ability to recycle or even just contain your plastic waste in a landfill site is quite reduced. Often waste is burned then, but in sufficiently burned and of course with other health effects, critical health effects related to that. There's a lot of mining of that resources happening together with others, and a lot of erosion, a lot of dumping of plastic waste, even when it is done in landfill sites, is done on river banks, and we explored that in particular along the Ganges drastically. We get a lot of erosion of that as well. So tackling that differs very much to what we just alluded to a second before, kind of retaining more fibers in wastewater treatment plants in more developed countries, which is a very different strategy, of course.
So this goes back to one maybe last question I'll ask by Jacqueline again. So how can international governments kind of work collectively to, reduce, mitigate the impact of plastic pollution? And what if there's pushback from one of those foreign governments? Is it possible to create a global industry to collect plastics? What are some kind of strategies that could be implemented in a coordinated way, do you think?
Yeah, I think it looks promising because it is such an emotionally loaded topic that there's a lot of customer pressure on industries, and from my experience, the majority of industries really want to be part of the solution here, and you see that through there's a lot of greenwashing, of course, going on as well. But I really feel there's, in all honesty, there's a lot of industries that want to be part of the pollution. There actually this week there have been discussions of global treaties to reduce the impact of plastic waste. My government has just decided 2 days ago to actually sign up to that. We were not sure if they would. And the most encouraging changes I've actually seen in low and middle income countries, traveling through India, Vietnam, China exactly a year ago this week. I made photos on the airports that I traveled through because they all highlighted that these are now single-use plastic banned airports, and it's amazing. I know that the Pollution Control Board in this federal state of Bihar in India, who we work with a lot, they were one of the first to impose a single-use plastic ban. We didn't have one. Well, we still don't have one over here in Europe. So some of that countries are taking this really serious. We work with the government in Vietnam on implementing their ambitions to, they have a national action plan to reduce plastic. So there's a lot of action coming out of that countries, which make me very optimistic that even if some of our countries in let's say, the Western world fail to initially properly engage with that project, we see a lot of activity coming out of these growing economies where, frankly, also the majority of production is happening. So with that, and where a lot of our waste ends up. So I think that are promising tendencies.
I'm gonna one last question. This is from an undergraduate nano engineering student who I think would be a great master's student for you to take on. Erica Petronero is her name. What's the lower limit to the size of microplastics that can be detected? And is it likely that nanoplastic particles are going undetected?
It is very likely that they go undetected. We can detect them now. The real difficulty is to detect them, like we can engineer and detect them. The real difficulty is to detect them from any environmental media. If that's some gut tissue or like lung tissue or soil or water, that is the real difficulty. But there are the first approaches where this is done, mainly from air samples, but also from actually, we are doing that together with colleagues. Colleagues at University of Utrecht are doing that for some snow and ice samples that we are doing analyzing from Everest Base Camp right now, and they are looking into the nanofraction. That's some work that Steve and Deoni Allen are leading together with colleagues from Utrecht, and there's a lot of technology development there. And by all means, if you're interested in a master project, Jeff has my email. Contact me.
I am going to be a matchmaker in the hour of this call. Okay, we need to end there because, Stefan, we're going to take you now to the class who are teed up to discuss the paper you sent around. But on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you for a really stellar talk. This was very, very interesting, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
See you soon.